John Elway, Hall of Famer, two-time Super Bowl champion, and according to one high-profile lawsuit, potentially the biggest liar in the room when it mattered most. But before we dive into that explosive claim, let's acknowledge what makes this story so compelling. Elway's career wasn't just about throwing touchdowns and winning championships. It was about power, leverage, and an unmatched ability to reshape organizations around his will. For over 4 decades, his influence stretched across nearly half of the Denver Broncos' entire franchise history. Yet that same influence that built dynasties also created controversy that followed him from his first day as a prospect to his final years in the executive suite. In 2022, former Miami Dolphins head coach Brian Flores filed a lawsuit that sent shockwaves through the NFL. Among the teams named was the Denver Broncos, and at the center of the allegations stood John Elway himself. Flores claimed his January 2019 interview for the Broncos head coaching position was nothing more than a sham. According to the lawsuit, the interview was conducted solely to satisfy the NFL's Rooney Rule, which mandates teams interview at least one minority candidate for head coaching positions. But here's where it gets damaging. Flores didn't just allege the interview was fake. He claimed Elway and the other Broncos executives showed up an hour late, looked completely disheveled, and that it was obvious they had been drinking heavily the night before. In Flores' view, the team never had any intention of considering him as a legitimate candidate. The Broncos ultimately hired Vic Fangio, who is white, for the position. Elway fired back hard. He called the claims false and defamatory, insisting his character, integrity, and professionalism had been attacked. The Broncos organization backed him up, stating the interview began promptly at the scheduled time of 7:30 in the morning in Providence, Rhode Island, and lasted the fully allotted time of 3.5 hours. Elway insisted he was prepared, ready, and fully engaged throughout the entire process. But here's where his defense gets interesting. While he denied drinking heavily, he didn't exactly deny looking disheveled. Instead, he offered a logistical explanation. He said the team had flown in during the middle of the night, immediately following another interview in Denver, and were running on just a few hours of sleep to meet the only window Flores had provided them. He concluded that Flores' assumptions about his appearance and state of mind were subjective, hurtful, and just plain wrong. But let's be real here. When you're conducting a high-stakes interview mandated by a league-wide diversity policy, showing up exhausted and disheveled because you prioritized back-to-back interviews over rest sends a message. From the candidate's perspective, it doesn't matter if the executives were drunk or just tired. What matters is how seriously they took the process. And if you can't manage your travel schedule to show up looking professional and alert, it raises legitimate questions about how much you actually valued that interview. This wasn't just some random meeting. This was an opportunity to potentially change someone's career trajectory. And the fact that Elway's own defense validated part of Flores' description suggests there might have been more truth to the claim of a sham interview than the Broncos wanted to admit. If you're shocked by how Elway's executive career ended up mired in controversy, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us which of his conflicts you find the most troubling. Because what we're about to reveal shows this pattern goes way back. This wasn't the first time Elway found himself at the center of organizational chaos. In fact, his entire career was built on it. Let's rewind to 1983, where a young John Elway was about to become the biggest draft day defector in NFL history. The 1983 draft was legendary, known as the quarterback class of 1983. But even in that stacked class, Elway stood apart. He was universally viewed as the undisputed top collegiate prospect, arguably the most highly regarded talent since Joe Namath. San Francisco 49ers head coach Bill Walsh praised him as ranking among the great rifle-armed passers the game has produced. Dallas Cowboys Vice President Gil Brandt went even further, stating he would select Elway first overall, even if his team already had Joe Montana. The Baltimore Colts held the #1 pick and selected Elway. But there was a problem. Elway's agent, Marvin DeMoff, had publicly announced ahead of the draft that Elway would refuse to play for the organization. He cited a preference for a West Coast team. And this wasn't an empty threat. Elway had a legitimate backup plan. He was a serious Major League Baseball prospect for the New York Yankees. He had already demonstrated his capability, batting .318 for the Yankees Class A team and won on to New York during the summer before his senior season. This credible threat to defect to baseball was the primary weapon Elway used to force his way out of Baltimore. Inside the Colts organization, there was a civil war brewing. General Manager Ernie Accorsi was described as principled and steadfast in his determination. He was initially adamant that he would not trade Elway. Accorsi privately viewed Elway as one of the most talented quarterbacks he had ever seen and feared being known as the GM who traded away the next Johnny Unitas. He maintained the organizational stance that if they drafted him and held his rights, Elway would eventually come around and play for Baltimore. He believed the baseball threat wasn't serious, but Colts owner Robert Irsay had other plans. Prioritizing organizational stability and financial resolution, Irsay instructed Accorsi to trade Elway. He cited the prospect's clear unwillingness to play in Baltimore. Irsay effectively took charge within a week of the draft. Denver Broncos owner Edgar Kaiser played a key role in exploiting this internal fissure by avoiding the normal chain of command. He maintained direct contact with Irsay and flattered him before bringing up the possibility of a trade. The trade was finalized only after Elway flew to Denver to negotiate a contract, prepared to immediately leave if the deal fell through. Here's the kicker. The Colts had been flooded with trade offers. Prior to the draft, the Raiders offered 3 first-round picks and quarterback Mark Wilson. The Chargers offered a package including the 20th and 22nd overall picks. Despite these massive offers, the Broncos secured the deal with compensation ultimately centered around offensive lineman Chris Hinton. Broncos coach Dan Reeves called it a good deal upon hearing the compensation. Reports at the time suggested Denver had never really come up with a good offer initially. The Colts organization, under Irsay's mandate, ultimately prioritized resolving the immediate public relations and financial crisis over maximizing the trade asset return. Elway had successfully circumvented the NFL's fundamental labor structure and created his own form of free agency, but in doing so, he landed himself directly into another war. The conflict that would define Elway's first decade in Denver was his sustained public dispute with head coach Dan Reeves. Despite the success of reaching 3 Super Bowls, their relationship was toxic. Elway later described the environment as hell, admitting things were tough from the first year. The friction stemmed primarily from deeply opposing philosophies regarding offensive design. Reeves favored a traditional run-first system that emphasized hierarchy and control. Elway, supported by his eventual offensive coordinator Mike Shanahan, sought a modern pass-oriented offense that fully exploited his generational talent. Elway consistently felt that Reeves refused to open up his system or sufficiently utilize the talent surrounding him. The statistical consequence of this toxic period is measurable and damning. From 1983 to 1992, Elway's production was objectively underwhelming for a player of his status. He threw 158 touchdowns against 157 interceptions, resulting in a career passer rating of just 73.8 over his first 10 seasons. Among 15 quarterbacks who started at least 80 games during that decade, Elway ranked 14th in passer rating. He statistically outperformed only journeyman Jay Schroeder. This data strongly suggests the restrictive offensive philosophy and intense organizational friction actively suppressed the performance of a Hall of Fame level talent. The feud dramatically escalated with the firing of Elway's preferred offensive coordinator Mike Shanahan in 1992. The specific rationale for the firing immediately became a point of conflict. Shanahan recounted that Reeves told him man-to-man that the firing was due to Reeves wanting to personally call the offensive plays. Shanahan accepted that reason at the time. However, just days later, the Denver Post reported that the reason for the separation was insubordination. Shanahan stated he despises that charge and felt Reeves was not upfront with him, believing the accusation was politically motivated. Reeves, in turn, publicly questioned Shanahan's loyalty, asking why he had to learn about Elway's displeasure with him by reading it in the newspaper in 1990. Shanahan asserted that Reeves was fully aware of the strained relationship, noting that everybody in this town knows that their relationship was tough. This internal conflict was further exemplified by the scripted plays dispute. Reeves charged that Elway and Shanahan were subverting the system by secretly scripting plays. Elway defended the practice, explaining that he merely asked Shanahan and Gary Kubiak to help him select the first 10 plays from the existing game plan because he was often overfired up at the start of a game. By shifting the public rationale for Shanahan's firing from a philosophical difference to a charge of insubordination, Reeves changed the battleground from operational disagreement to a question of ethics and loyalty. But the most blatant demonstration of Reeves's intent to assert hierarchical control came during the 1992 NFL Draft. Despite coming off an AFC Championship game appearance and holding the 25th overall pick, Reeves used the selection to draft UCLA sophomore quarterback Tommy Maddox. This move occurred despite reports that Elway had publicly stated he desired offensive line reinforcements. The drafting of Maddox was widely perceived as a direct political move, asserting that the franchise quarterback was replaceable. It fueled the perception that Reeves actively sought to get rid of him so bad. This action culminated in a period of intense organizational hostility. The feud ended with Reeves's eventual firing. Mike Shanahan returned to the franchise and ultimately coached Elway to back-to-back Super Bowl victories. The symbolic closure of the conflict came in Elway's final game, Super Bowl 33, a decisive victory over Reeves, who was then coaching the Atlanta Falcons. John Elway's professional history reveals a man who understood power better than almost anyone in sports. In 1983, he challenged the established player-team binding mechanism of the draft by wielding the credible threat of defection to baseball. This defiance earned him the organizational placement he desired, but it immediately threw him into an organizational war with Dan Reeves, a feud that severely hampered his statistical production, but ultimately resulted in Elway winning the internal political battle. By the time of the Brian Flores lawsuit in 2022, Elway's role had completely reversed. He was no longer the disruptor. He was the defender of the organizational status quo, defending the integrity of an institutional process against claims that his management team lacked professional preparation. Despite all the controversy, all the conflict, and all the accusations, Elway's on-field greatness remains undeniable. He revolutionized the quarterback position with his mobility and arm strength. He dragged teams to Super Bowls that had no business being there. And when the system finally aligned with his talent under Shanahan, he delivered back-to-back championships that cemented his Hall of Fame legacy. His executive tenure brought Peyton Manning to Denver and built a championship roster. Whatever the controversies, Elway's impact on football is permanent and profound. Now we want to hear from you. Which of Elway's controversies do you think had the biggest impact on his legacy? Was it the way he forced his way out of Baltimore? The decade-long war with Dan Reeves? Or the allegations in the Brian Flores lawsuit? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure you subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories that shaped sports history.